Villains are a critical component to many stories. They provide necessary conflict, contrast, and opposition to the heroes of the story. Some of the most intimidating and memorable villains in cinema are characters such as Darth Vader, Scar, Terminator, Saruman, and Joker. Now, I did just list off a bunch of male characters, but there are also memorable female villains as well. Characters such as Harley Quinn, Bellatrix Lestrange, or the Wicked Witch of the West. I've been thinking about villains a lot recently, particularly the difference between male and female villains. I was mentally creating a list of female villains and a list of male villains. From the lists that I had created from my own memory, I couldn't help but notice a significant difference between the male and female villains. Most male villains I could think of were more serious, intimidating, and held a high level of gravitas. Most female villains, however, felt pretty opposite. The majority were characterized as crazy and unstable, not so much intimidating as just unpredictable and explosive. So I thought, maybe I just need to do more research. But my research into other female villains just seemed to confirm to me that the majority of them had a strong crazy factor. From the list of female villains that I had initially created, however, there was one that stood out from the rest. One that felt more intimidating, calculating, and serious. And that was the White Witch from Narnia, played by none other than Tilda Swinton. The White Witch felt like the complete opposite of, say, Bellatrix from Harry Potter. I found her to be a much more formidable and terrifying villain. And this bothered me. Why was it that with all these movies I had watched, I felt that very few female villains had similar treatment as the White Witch in their stories? Why did it feel like most were written to be psychotic and unhinged rather than serious and formidable? In the many days that I was contemplating this, my family watched Nobody 2, which had another crazy female villain. As we were watching it, this female villain had the scene where she was preparing to bring her henchmen to where the good guys were located, and as she was preparing, she started doing a dance, just to further showcase how crazy she was. And during this scene, my brother said something along the lines of, "It's easier for me to buy a crazy female villain than a crazy male villain. When a guy is dancing around, I don't buy it. But when a crazy female villain does it, I'm like, yeah, she's crazy." Which is a pretty interesting point. It seems easier to believe a crazy female villain and easier to believe a serious male villain. But did that necessarily mean that female villains can't be written in a serious manner? Was the White Witch just a fluke? No, I don't believe so. I think that it just requires a lot more effort, care, and specific parameters in order to create a calm and intimidating female villain. The difficulty of creating such a character is probably why we see lots of crazy female villains rather than serious ones. It's a lot harder to write the serious ones. I don't believe female villains could ever be written to have that same gravitas as male villains, but I believe that female villains can receive similar treatment. And that is what we will be exploring in this video. Can female villains be formidable and serious rather than just crazy and unstable? And what are the specific requirements needed to create such a villain? So first we're going to go through the different components that I think are required for creating an intimidating female villain. And the golden example that I want to analyze is the White Witch. The first and most obvious component is that the character should have a calm demeanor. Throughout the Narnia movie, the White Witch appears calm and patient. Every move she makes, every time she speaks, every decision is deliberate and calculated. She carries her power gracefully rather than explosively. She is motivated by her great desire to remain in complete control over Narnia, but she does not intend to accomplish her goals through sheer force. She uses stratagem and subtlety as well. She tried various attempts to destroy the prophecy of the new rulers in Narnia. She manipulated Edmund to gather information on his siblings. She used the law of the deep magic to claim Edmund, planning on killing him. Even Aslan cannot deny that, by this law, she has control of Edmund. She is confident in her plans and, while being fearful of Aslan, calmly stands against him to stake her claim. She is composed most of the time that we see her. Even when she grows angry, she does not lash out in a manic manner, yelling wildly or throwing her arms about. She controls her anger and channels it towards others, intimidating them and putting them back in their place. The White Witch was composed, calculating, and confident. And that is component number 1. Along with being crafty and manipulative, the White Witch has a pretty intimidating presence, which I think is an important component for great villains. Tilda Swinton is tall. She is 5'11". Her height allowed this character to have a greater presence and appear more of a physical threat. If you think of the most iconic male villains, such as Darth Vader, they have a great physical, demanding presence, and when they walk in the room, you can feel that they are in command. While female characters won't be able to have that exact same effect, I do think how tall and strong the character appears is an important factor to how formidable they can be. If the White Witch appeared very small, I strongly believe that her character's confidence would feel a bit less believable. When female villains are smaller or weaker looking, they aren't as intimidating, and thus I believe they are written as unhinged and unpredictable to compensate. And I would just like to also add that wardrobing also plays a huge role in this as well. Darth Vader's cape and helmet, the White Witch's dresses, both added so much to the character's demanding presences. Imagine if instead of how she looks in this movie, they cast someone who was 5'5", gave her a simpler wardrobe and disheveled her hair, such as Bellatrix's hair. As well as appearing to be a physical threat, she actually is one. Which brings us to component number 3, the villain must pose a physical and powerful threat to the protagonist. How this next component is achieved for female villains will depend on who the protagonist is. For the good majority of female villains I can think of, their opponent is either another female or someone younger and weaker than them, protagonists such as Snow White or the Children from Narnia. You get the idea. However, there are some examples where this is not the case. Ghost in Ant-Man and the Wasp fights Ant-Man. Hela in Thor Ragnarok fights Thor. Azula in Avatar The Last Airbender frequently fights Zuko and other male characters her same age. The key thing here is that these female villains have special superhuman abilities and powers. If you are writing a story where there is no magic or superpowers or advanced weaponry, I believe that the protagonist would need to be another female or someone younger and physically weaker than this female villain. If power or magic does exist, this allows for the playing field to be leveled and for a female antagonist to more believably go one-on-one with a male character. And I have a whole video where I kind of go into more depth about this regarding female action leads, but anyway, the protagonist of the story needs to be believably intimidated by this female villain. Women would be intimidated by other women, young children would be intimidated by an adult female villain, but no adult man would be intimidated going toe-to-toe with a female villain, not unless the story allowed for the playing field to be leveled in some way. Of course, I guess this doesn't really matter if there's no physical fighting in the movie, but then your movie is kind of boring, and how intimidating is your villain, really? The fourth component is the voice. You can make a character appear as intimidating as you want by casting someone tall and providing them with a great wardrobe, but all of that effort is for naught if the villain's voice does not match. A prime example of this is the original voice actor for Darth Vader.
Find the passengers of this vessel. I want them alive!
The actor that actually portrayed the character of Darth Vader on set was David Prowse. He was very tall, which was what was needed for this character. His voice, however, did not match well with what the character looked like. The creators of Star Wars felt that this didn't work, and they hired James Earl Jones to do the voice. James Earl Jones had a very deep voice that changed the character and transformed him into the menacing, terrible villain that we all know today. And I think the same thing is important for female villains as well. Azula is a pretty famous female villain, but I've often found her voice a bit too... And I'm not trying to be mean to the voice actor, I think she did a good job, but it was a bit too shrill, high-pitched. It gave the character a more I'm crazy vibe rather than I'm intimidating.
No, you miscalculated. You should have feared me more.
It worked for the character because the character was written as pretty psycho. It was even worse in Netflix's live-action portrayal, though. The last scene of her in the first season was pretty hilarious to me. She was giving her speech, and I was actually afraid that her voice would be a bit too high-pitched and girly. I mean, she is a girl, but, you know. She finished her speech, and I commented to my siblings who I was watching this with, that wasn't so bad. I was afraid her voice would be too high-pitched. And right as I finished that sentence, this happened. Look, I have absolutely nothing against this actress. I just think that they could have given her another chance at this last shot. Why would they use this take? To contrast, let's take a look at an example of what I think is one of the best commanding voices from a young female character.
Give me the coordinates to the Sea of Monsters. Now.
Hey! I'm talking to you, maggots! Got a lot of ocean to cover and not a lot of time.
Also, side note, the casting in the Percy Jackson show is top-notch. Mind you, this character is not a villain, but I think this somewhat illustrates my point. She had a very strong, commanding voice that I could take seriously. If she were to portray a villain, I think she would do a great job. The White Witch's calm and menacing demeanor would have been ruined every time she talked if her voice sounded too timid, soft, or squeaky. Tilda Swinton, however, did not have this problem and was able to provide a smooth, strong, and commanding voice that the character needed. The fifth and final key component is that this villain is the leader in the story. I think that for female villains to be at their greatest and most formidable, they need to be the leader of all the villains, or just have no other villains that they are being commanded by. They either need to be the sole villain of the story or the leader of the villains in the story. Both Bellatrix Lestrange and Harley Quinn seem to be treated more as pawns in their respective stories, being used by the main villain rather than working to achieve their own goals. A villain with no motivation other than to serve and assist a different, more powerful villain is not very intimidating. Allowing the story to focus on this female villain and their objectives will allow for their character and motivations to be more easily explored and for the audience to get a better sense of how terrifying this villain is. Having them just be blind mice following another villain does not make for a very compelling, nuanced villain and will not land them next to the White Witch in my ranking system. And there you have it. Those are all the necessary character components I think are required to create a female villain to be at her most formidable. Important note, there are still great female villains that don't meet all of these requirements, but I think that the greatest female villains have all of these components. All right. Now that we've taken a look at the White Witch character and identified what components are needed to craft an intimidating female villain, which other female villains have all of these components? Which female villains, aside from the White Witch, make this calculating category and which make the crazy category? I've actually broken it down into 3 separate categories. The first is most formidable. In this category are the female villains, along with the White Witch, that have met all of these requirements. And in this list, we have Maleficent, specifically in the animated version. And that's it.
That's it?
Of all the female villains that I know of, only 2 of them made the cut of being the most formidable. The White Witch is obviously in this category, and Maleficent also met all of these requirements. She was composed, calculating, and calm. She has an intimidating presence and appears as a physical threat. She also proved that she was a powerful threat to the protagonist. She had a commanding voice, and she was the leader rather than a follower. And I was so expecting Varang to make this list. The trailers, however, didn't show all of her craziness. I feel she, along with a few others, made all but one component, so she was very close, but not quite. Which brings me to the second category, very close but not quite. In this category are the female villains that met all but one of the requirements that I listed. First, we have the villains that failed to meet the physical strength and intimidation. This includes Mother Gothel and the Evil Queen. Mother Gothel was a tricky one for me to categorize. She is a pretty frightening villain for sure. However, she is not a physical threat in the story. If Rapunzel were the only protagonist, I'm sure she would be. But we also have Flynn, who Mother Gothel does not pose a physical threat to. She's not a physically intimidating or powerful villain. She has to sneak behind the male characters in the story to surprise attack them. So scary, crafty, but not really physically intimidating. And the Evil Queen? She is also pretty terrifying as a villain, but then she gets chased down by a bunch of dwarves and falls off a cliff. So close, but not quite. Hela and Varang are similar in that they are missing the calm, cool, collected component. Varang is just crazy. And Hela was so close to being in the S tier, but her character was not written as calm as she could have been. She's power hungry and aims to achieve her goals with sheer force and destruction, rather than having any subtle strategies. She's reckless and a pretty wild character, which I think is also shown in the costuming. Her somewhat messy hair and makeup indicates that this character is not composed. And for these reasons, she is placed in close but not quite. And then Azula is actually missing 2 of the required character components, but I'm going to place her in close but not quite anyway. She's just a bit too psycho, and her voice just doesn't quite meet the criteria that I have decided it needs to.
Yes, I said so!
All of these villains are really great in their respective stories, but just not quite on the same level as the White Witch. And then the third category is completely unhinged. The characters included in this category are ones that fail to meet most of these requirements and are also written to be completely unstable for whatever reason. Their motives, actions, and even movements are very strange and unpredictable. They are prone to cackling and laughing at the heroes and in dark situations. They're very dedicated to the villainous cause, being scarily loyal, somewhat to a fault. Some of these kinds of characters work in their respective stories, but I feel that the more extreme and the more crazy these characters are, the less interesting they become. If someone is written as unstable and crazy, it's just not a very interesting character. They're insane. Cool. They cannot be reasoned with, their actions have no rhyme or reason, and do not require any explanation. The only explanation is they're doing this because they're insane.
He's happy because he's insane.
And in this category, I have Bellatrix, Harley Quinn, Wanda, the Wicked Witch, Rita Repulsa, Sophina, Agatha Harkness, Umbridge, Evelyn DeVore, and Cruella. And then I thought about it a bit more, and I think that Azula's character also belongs in this category. She gets to be placed in both. Because towards the end of the TV show, she really does go completely insane. She is completely unhinged at the end of this TV show. So her character, at different phases of the show, fits in both of these categories. She's an interesting case, for sure. And I also have Ghost, but she's a bit of an interesting case. She's not quite crazy for the sake of being crazy. And some might argue that she's not really a villain, just an antagonist. And I get that. This character's motivations are not to gain more power or control over anyone. She just wants to stop feeling the pain that she experiences constantly. But she is pretty crazy due to her physical condition, so she kind of fits here in this category. And the heroes try to reason with her, but she just gradually becomes more and more unstable and unwilling to be reasoned with. And then I wanted to throw this out there that there is a fourth and very unique category, which is the Yzma category. This character and the movie itself, they just have their own set of rules, and, I respect it. In conclusion, the key components to writing the most formidable female villain are: number 1, they need to be calm, composed, and calculating. Number 2, they need to have an intimidating appearance. Number 3, they need to be a physical threat. Number 4, they need to have a commanding voice. And number 5, they need to be a leader. An important question is, do these components also apply to male characters? Yeah, I think that they do. Except for the requirement of needing a female or young protagonist or superpowers, I think that most of these components can apply to men as well. I just think it's more interesting to talk about female villains because I just do. Female villains, at least believable ones, exist mostly in fantasy stories where powers and magic allow for things to be evened out between men and women. And also, most action movies have male main characters, and thus most have male villains to contrast the male hero. And there's nothing wrong with that. I just find it more interesting to look at the female villains that we do have and analyze how they are written and how they can be written to be formidable in their own right. I do, however, think that for creating the most formidable villains for both men and women, these components should be incorporated. I do also think that to craft a female villain, it's a lot harder, and these components are a lot harder to meet for women than for men. Female villains take a lot more work to be believable and intimidating, and a lot of writers seem to just take the easy route of just making them unstable and crazy, which is not something that I appreciate. Writing this, however, I was pretty surprised at how many female villains I ended up finding that were pretty close to meeting the mark. And I'm so sure that there are other female villains that someone's gonna be shocked that I didn't list. If there are any that I missed that you think I should have talked about, let me know. And let me know if you agree or disagree with anything that I've said, and let me know which female villain you think is the golden example. But if it's not Tilda Swinton's The White Witch, you're wrong. I don't make the rules.